Hello and welcome, everyone. Welcome to this presentation today. I am Shweta Mishra, Marketing and Communications Lead at Trilex, and your moderator for today's webinar. We are really glad to have you all for today's session, where we are talking about designing effective AI prompts for patient-friendly clinical trial listings. So let's start with a very simple reality. For many patients, the journey into clinical trial actually begins with a lot of confusion. They try searching for studies, find something relevant, but they are quickly met with dense technical language written for scientific accuracy and not really for patients' understanding. And that creates a huge gap between interest and action and between eligibility and enrollment. And now, artificial intelligence has the potential to bridge this gap, but that works only when it's guided effectively. And that's where prompt design becomes very critical. So today's session is focused on something very practical, how we can use AI to turn complex clinical trial information into clear, patient-friendly content without losing accuracy. We will share some real examples and lessons on translating technical language, designing better prompts, and improving consistency across outputs. We will also hear some industry perspectives from Krista Godel from Sanofi. I'll quickly introduce our speaker for today, which is Sarah Shu. Sarah began her career as a healthcare journalist at the Wall Street Journal and later spent 13 years at Pfizer across oncology and rare diseases, focusing patient support and clinical trial recruitment. Today at Trilex, she's serving as a strategic advisor, bringing deep industry insight and a strong focus on making clinical research more accessible to patients. Before we begin with the webinar, a little bit about the logistics. Please look at your video settings and set it to 720 pixels image resolution so you can get the best audio and video quality throughout the webinar today. At the end, we will have a 10-minute Q&A session where we will invite audience questions. So please feel free to drop your questions as we go along the presentation in our chat box here. We will also air this live on YouTube, so you can also join there and put your questions in their YouTube chat box. So we will now start. I will pass it on to Sarah now for beginning the presentation. Sarah, over to you now.
All right, thanks, Shweta. And hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to start with the problem that we're trying to address. I think most people in this space have encountered this problem in one way or another. When patients go looking for clinical trials, they're often met with language like this. This is a snapshot of the kinds of terms that commonly show up in clinical trial listings. Terms that are familiar to people in the scientific community, but not necessarily to somebody trying to understand whether a study might be right for them. Let's take a look for a moment at what a patient searching online for clinical trials might experience. So in this case, the example search is for ovarian cancer clinical trials. This is a serious disease, and for many patients and caregivers, this kind of search is happening at a very stressful time. They put it into Google, and the first organic search result that comes up is from the National Cancer Institute, a highly credible and trusted source. So they go there, and they're presented with study titles like these. Even at this stage, before clicking to learn more about a specific study, you can start to see how quickly the experience becomes challenging. The study titles are loaded with multi-syllable drug names, along with terms like combination treatment, an acronym for a genetic mutation known as RAS, and something called combo match. For most people, deciding what study to click on first probably is not obvious, but let's just go ahead and click on the first one on the list. All right, so what do we find here? In this short description, there are more than a dozen multisyllable terms, most of them unlikely to be familiar to someone without a medical background. There is some explanatory content if you read closely and make it all the way through, but overall this is dense, complex information. And even if you do understand it, it still doesn't answer a very practical question. What would it actually be like to participate in this study? Now, another question a patient might have, is this study for people like me? So let's click into the eligibility criteria. And this is what we find. I won't go through this line by line, but you can see that this is not presented in a way that makes it easy for a patient to quickly understand whether they might qualify. So a little background on why this is such a common problem, and it's not because anybody is purposely trying to confuse patients. Much of the content that patients find online originates from clinical trial listings that sponsors are required to submit to government websites like clinicaltrials.gov. These listings are designed to meet scientific and regulatory requirements, so they include a lot of technical detail. There are a few fields that are intended for a lay audience, but in practice, the listings are usually written by clinical teams that are focused on designing and executing the studies and not necessarily on patient communication. Once they're posted on clinicaltrials.gov, the listings are then picked up and reused across many other websites, like the NCI site we were just looking at. In fact, the version of that ovarian cancer study you see here is a screenshot from clinicaltrials.gov, and it matches what you saw there. Study sponsors do create patient recruitment websites for some trials, and those are designed for a lay audience, but these technical listings still show up widely in search results and often more prominently. So, what does this mean for patients? What this creates for many of them is a comprehension gap. The information is there, but it's not always accessible or easy to act upon. And that's where AI-driven simplification can start to make a difference. So with that context in mind, I'm going to walk through how AI simplified listings were developed and how they're designed to help bridge that comprehension gap. TrialX introduced AI simplified listings in late 2024. The platform takes study information from clinicaltrials.gov or from other materials that our clients provide, and it applies a structured prompt that tells the AI model to translate that information into a patient-friendly study description. So you can see a few highlights from the prompt here. First, it defines the AI's role and task to create patient-friendly summaries of the trials. It then provides guidance on both how to write and what to include. So that means using clear, neutral language at a set reading level and focusing on information like what the study is, who it's for, and what participation involves. This simplified version is then displayed alongside the original listing online so that patients can easily move between the two and refer to both. Before launching AI simplified listings, TrialX conducted a structured review to test their quality. Human reviewers compared the AI-generated summaries to the original trial listings that they were based on and assessed them across three main criteria:
Who?
accuracy, relevance,
No.
and clarity. Across multiple
Okay.
trials and across multiple trials and therapeutic areas, the summaries generally captured key study information clearly and accurately. So this provides a strong foundation and a meaningful step forward for patients. But as with any approach like this, there's still room to improve. How AI is applied, as we all know, continues to evolve very rapidly, and in parallel, our clients are actively looking for ways to make these listings even more patient-centered. So with that in mind, I took a closer look at live listings that have appeared recently on client websites to find opportunities to strengthen them. Before going to that, let's go back for a moment to that ovarian cancer study. Here you can see that same study posted on trialx.com. This is the original listing, and then a patient can click over and see the AI simplified version. This is not a client example, and it actually uses an earlier version of the prompt than what clients are using today. But even so, you can see that it's more patient-friendly. It opens with a clearer explanation of who the study is for, it's generally easier to follow, and it does a better job of highlighting what participation involves. At the same time, there's room for improvement. One thing that likely stands out to you is that the paragraph is fairly long, and it packs in a lot of information. So this example illustrates that AI simplification does improve clarity, but there are still opportunities to make these summaries even better. With that in mind, I'll walk you through how I approached identifying those opportunities. I reviewed 20 AI simplified listings that appeared recently on live client websites. I compared them to the source listings, and then I edited them myself offline as an exercise to identify recurring patterns. From there, I developed an updated prompt design based on those observations. One quick note I'll make is that the edits I made, which I'll show, a few of them in the next slides, they're meant to serve as examples. You may have different perspectives on specific wording choices, and I'll also caveat that I'm not a doctor, though I've done my best to keep the language accurate. But what I'm really aiming to highlight here is where clarity, structure, and the details presented could be further improved. All right, so let's start looking at some of those key observations. First, I included a variety of study types in my review. So, trying to go across a range of therapeutic areas, drug and device studies, and a mix of other intervention types to capture patterns across a range of scenarios. At a high level, two main themes emerged. The first is around writing clarity and readability, things like how complex terminology is handled, how sentences and paragraphs are structured, and whether the overall story flow feels intuitive. The second theme is around how the study is framed and what's emphasized, whether it centers on the participant experience rather than technical trial design details, and how well the description captures relevant information about study procedures and eligibility. Here you can see the original AI simplified listing from the client website on the left and the version that I edited offline on the right. So first, highlighted in yellow, some of the complex or multi-syllable words on the left are replaced with plainer language on the right. Second, in blue, some of the medical or technical terms are either replaced with simpler alternatives or kept but briefly explained when there isn't a natural replacement for them. Similarly, sentence and paragraph structure can sometimes be a bit dense, with long sentences that include multiple ideas and aren't always phrased in the most intuitive way. Breaking these into shorter segments that focus on who does what, essentially subject followed by action verb rather than more passive phrasing, helps make the language clearer and more direct. In the second example, you can also see how restructuring the eligibility criteria into bullets with parallel phrasing makes it much easier to scan and digest. Another key theme is the overall flow of how the study is described. In some listings, the opening paragraph just tries to cover too much at once. The study purpose, the condition, sometimes also the procedures, and as well as technical protocol design details. What works better is breaking those into a clearer sequence of bite-sized ideas. The opening focuses solely on the study purpose and who it's for, and then the body moves into the human experience of participating in the study, what treatments participants will receive, for how long, and key monitoring activities, without getting into more technical or nuanced concepts like randomization and blinding. These will be covered in informed consent. One thing to note is that the level of detail in the source listing can vary. When there's limited information about study procedures in the source, the AI at times may default to general descriptions that could apply to almost any study. In other cases, I noticed that useful detail was available but not incorporated, so there's an opportunity to make better use of that information. So these examples illustrate some of the points I was just making. In the original live versions on the left, the blue and yellow highlights show technical trial design language or generalized descriptions of study procedures. Especially in that second example, you can see that the terminology is very closely tied to various aspects of the study design. In the edited version, that shifts to more direct language about what participants will receive and do. You'll also notice in the first example that some of the more detailed information about how the study treatments are given, shown in green, is moved to later flow on the right, which makes the overall description easier to follow. Finally, moving on to the who can participate section, the eligibility criteria are now in bullets, making them easier to digest. But beyond format, one pattern I saw is that simplifying the list of criteria can sometimes leave out important parts of a requirement or miss details that would help patients understand who the study is really for. So in the first example here, the third bullet in blue on the right clarifies that prior treatments must have either not worked well enough or caused difficult side effects. And that second piece of the requirement was missing on the left. Up above that, in the first bullet on the right, the edited version is also more specific about the developmental requirement for teenage participants. In the second example, the edited version adds more context around recent heart failure events, testing, and treatment history. And it also calls out that the study is invitation only, which is a very important piece of information for patients to know. So while we certainly can't list all of the eligibility criteria, there's an opportunity to set clearer guardrails so that they're simplified but still informative. So pausing for a moment, I hope that last section of the presentation wasn't too didactic. From a personal perspective, with a background in explanatory writing, what I just showed you just now was actually the easy part. I could sit down with each listing, I could edit it, and I could see patterns in what I was changing. The harder part for me was this. How do I actually get the AI to write it that way in the first place? That turned out to be a very iterative process, and my main partner was actually ChatGPT. So I started by identifying the principles I wanted to apply to the listings. I shared before and after examples of my edits, and I worked with it to shape the prompt. And from there, it became a cycle: test the outputs, revise the prompt, and repeat. And I will say I can sort of understand why some people talk about developing a relationship of sorts with these tools. I really did feel like I was collaborating, at least with a professional partner that had both strengths and limitations. So with that, I'm going to walk you through the updated prompt design. The themes I went through just now directly informed the updated prompt. The strong foundations of the original prompt were retained, while guidance around plain language, organization, and focusing content around the participant experience was expanded. So let's see what that looks like. Looking at the overall structure, the updated prompt is significantly more detailed. It introduces a structured workflow to guide the process of generating the listing, more explicit writing and terminology guidance, and more detailed direction on what information goes in each section. This opening section defines the AI model's role and task and more clearly specifies the audience. It's not just patients generally, but specifically people who may be considering trial participation. Another key addition is a structured generation workflow, which guides the model to build the summary step by step. The original prompt did include some step-by-step guidance, but this makes the sequence more explicit, helping the model apply the guidance consistently and organize the content in a more logical way. Next, the core principles highlight the key themes that the model should follow throughout the listing: clarity, accuracy, a neutral tone, and a focus on what matters most for patient understanding. Again, some of these concepts were in the original prompt, but much of the guidance has been deepened, particularly around striking a balance between brevity and clarity, preserving meaning, and focusing on the participant experience. This next section brings together the writing and terminology guidance. It emphasizes shorter, more direct sentences and using plain language alternatives wherever possible. The prompt also includes example word substitutions, and a few of them are shown here to illustrate some of those substitutions. These can absolutely be adjusted based on client preferences or clinical judgment. That said, I just want to pause on one example and just gently challenge some of you for a moment. I have a feeling that some of you may feel very hesitant about replacing a word like investigational. It's a very well accepted term in the clinical research lexicon. But if you step back and look at it from a patient perspective, it's a 15-letter, 6-syllable word, and it's not one that most people encounter in everyday language. Compare that to something like study, 5 letters, 2 syllables, and easier to understand and relate to without sounding promotional. So there isn't a single right answer here, but it's worth considering how the language will be experienced by patients. Some of you also might hesitate about medicine instead of medication. From my perspective, that one's a little bit more of a toss-up, but I've used medicine here since it's a little bit shorter and simpler. The next section of the prompt focuses on how the listing is structured and what content goes where. The title and opening introduce what the study is about and who it's for. Then the body focuses on what participants will receive and do, how long treatment lasts, and key monitoring activities, while minimizing use of technical protocol language. The prompt also instructs the model not to introduce procedures or monitoring that are not explicitly stated in the source listing. The Who Can Participate section now uses bullets, and it tries to focus on the criteria that most clearly define the study population. Relatively complex criteria should be summarized at a high level without losing key meaning. For study logistics, the guidance focuses on clearly presenting the timing of the study and the number and location of visits. Finally, the prompt includes a validation step to ensure the summary is true to the source listing, follows the required structure, and applies the writing and content guidance consistently. All right, so drum roll, please. I'm going to walk through example outputs from the updated prompt. I think you'll see some clear improvements with a few areas that can still be fine-tuned. This here shows the original AI simplified listing from the live client website on the left and the output from the updated prompt on the right. Starting at the top in yellow, you can see clearer plain language wording to introduce the study. That's followed by a brief explanation of the neovascular type of macular degeneration. In turquoise, there's also some added context on the study population, although ideally this could go a step further in explaining what anti-VEGF means. Another thing to highlight is how the story flow is made more digestible. The version on the left packs a lot of complex information into the opening paragraph. On the right side in green, some of that detail is moved into the second paragraph and reframed to focus more directly on what participants will receive and what will happen in the study. Finally, some of the more technical design concepts, like randomization and blinding, highlighted in maroon on the left, are intentionally left out in the updated version. Here, the eligibility criteria are presented in bullets, with a bit more context on prior treatments described in the third bullet on the right. One trade-off you can see is that the exclusion criteria list is fairly long, and this is something I'm going to come back to shortly when we talk about tailoring the prompt to different priorities. Moving down, you'll notice that there's a study details section on the left but not on the right. That section has been removed in the updated prompt because it typically just repeated information from the body paragraph. And finally, you can see that a study timeline and visits section is on the right. That section was part of the original prompt, but it didn't appear consistently in the listings. The updated prompt gives more explicit guidance on how to generate it. Moving on to a second example, you can see similar types of updates here. What I really want to speak about is what can happen when there's rich source material for the model to work with. In the second paragraph in green on the right, the updated version reads much more like a step-by-step walkthrough of the participant experience, and it brings in relevant details from the source that weren't fully reflected before. There are a few details I would have left out, like noting that about a tablespoon of blood would be drawn. That's probably too much information for the average patient. But overall, this is much more participant-centered and relatable with less technical jargon. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip the other sections of this particular listing, and I want to bring us back to where we started, that same ovarian cancer study we were looking at on the NCI website. So I pulled the clinicaltrials.gov information for that study into our platform, and I ran it against the updated prompt, and this is the output. I'll start by saying it's not perfect. For example, I'd like to see a bit more explanation of the various aspects of this type of ovarian cancer that are mentioned in the opening paragraph. But overall, this is a meaningful step forward. The title and opening make it much more clear what the study is about and who it's for. And the second paragraph does a better job walking through what study treatments participants will receive and what the experience looks like. The eligibility criteria and timeline are also much easier to follow. And one thing I've learned working on this, that these outputs will not be perfect every time, and there's actually a risk of overcorrecting the prompt in reaction to any single one. In this case, going back to that opening paragraph, it is a particularly complex cancer type to explain, with aspects including mutations as well as HRD status, so the AI really had its work cut out for it. But at this point, we're clearly moving toward more understandable, patient-friendly listings while still maintaining accuracy. So stepping back from the examples, here are the key patterns that we're seeing. I won't read through each of these, but across the listings we tested, we're seeing clearer structure, more intuitive language, and a stronger focus on the participant experience. We also tested these outputs using the same evaluation method that was used when TrialX first launched the AI simplified listings, looking at accuracy, clarity, and relevance, and the updated prompts did show a directional improvement. As you saw in the examples, these improvements do come with some trade-offs. The main one is how much detail to include, whether you want shorter, more streamlined summaries, or ones that are more complete. And you saw both sides of that in the examples earlier, like that long list of exclusion criteria, or very specific details like that tablespoon of blood to be drawn. Stricter rules in the prompt, like limiting the number of participation criteria listed or removing numeric thresholds entirely, can keep the output more concise in some cases, but in other cases, they can actually leave out information that might be important for patients. Meanwhile, more flexible guidance, like what we've used here, tends to produce more complete summaries, but it sometimes includes details you might not want. In practice, I tend to favor that approach because I'd rather err on the side of more context than less. But ultimately, this is something that can be tailored, and clients can adjust the prompt based on their priorities, and we're also going to continue to try to fine-tune it. The final point I want to make for those of you who may work on the source listings. is that the quality of the AI simplified listing is heavily influenced by what's in the source. As I mentioned earlier, these listings are often written for scientific and regulatory purposes by the clinicians designing and running the study. But as you can see in this screenshot from clinicaltrials.gov, certain fields actually are intended for a lay audience. The AI can help translate that content and make your job a lot easier, but if the source is already a touch closer to the outcome you want, for example, by minimizing the use of highly technical terms, the model just has a much easier time doing its job. Even more importantly, the model is not creating new information. It's working with what's already there. So if key details about the study or participant experience are not included in the source, they will not show up in the summary. Meanwhile, more detail leads to more complete but often longer outputs, and more complex detail, like numeric thresholds, can carry through into more complex summaries. So in many ways, the source listing really sets the ceiling for what the AI can produce. So with that, I'd now like to transition the conversation back to Shweta, who's going to ask a couple of questions of somebody who's been working very closely on AI simplified listings on behalf of a study sponsor.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Nice presentation and very insightful for sure. I will now invite Krista Godel from Sanofi to share her perspectives and then open the floor for audience Q&A. I already see some couple of questions posted. We'll come to that in a few moments. But before that, Krista, could you please speak about your experiences with AI simplified listings and any best practices you would like to share with the audience today?
So for us, from a Sanofi perspective, we knew what a study should or shouldn't say from a legal perspective, a study team status. We just weren't able to implement that ourselves. So we were able to write, you know, instead of using investigational medication, use this term instead. Describe what a placebo is, give an example every time that is used. So we wrote kind of what we wanted and then used TrialX to add those prompts into the system to create what we use now. We also wanted a specific format. So each time you went into the study, regardless of which of the 100 studies you are looking at, to be consistent. So it was easier for the patients to jump from one study to another. I would say we implemented probably about 2 years ago. We went through 13 different reiterations before we actually went live. We also update on a monthly basis. So we look at the prompts that are getting used. Sarah provided some new recommendations, so we will implement them also. But how do we continually make it better? SanofiStudies.com is live in 20 countries and will expand to 30 by the end of the year. So we also had, how do you implement this across multiple countries? So in our perspective, it was either you have it or you don't have it. So we do have a disclaimer saying that, how AI is rewritten using the prompts and things like that. Some of them default to the AI rewrite, some of them default to original, just making sure they're both available. From our legal, regulatory, privacy perspective, and also IRB Ethics Committee, we took the approach that it is the same as what is written from the original content. So it is coming from clinicaltrials.gov. So it did not need any further review or approvals.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That was going to be my next question to you, Sarah. We hear a lot from the sponsors about balancing simplicity and compliance. So how do you approach that trade-off? So, yeah.
I think more is coming from IRB ethics committees. Like I said, we implemented about 2 years ago. So at that time, there really wasn't a lot related in terms of GCP and guidelines. More is coming out now that we might have to kind of revert. But our legal and privacy and our patient engagement leads, we're very excited to be able to to implement this. And we did also look at a patient perspective. So we did a comparison of, here's a couple of examples of what it was currently and what it is now, and they provided us suggestions for and feedback for things we can do better. So those are some of the things we update on a monthly basis if we have access to patients to do that review.
Right. Thank you. I see there's a question from Maha, and it is for you, Krista. And she asks, can the speaker from Sanofi speak to how open they are to AMCs using this tool on their study listings if the sites use TrialX products. That is, the study listing would come into TrialX from the site's data warehouse. Would the sponsor want the tool's AI capability listed in the CTN contract as well before the study start?
What is AMC?
Yes. The academic medical institutions. How open the academic medical institutions are to using this tool on their side.
So, like I said, our system is global. So we're in 20 countries now. All of our content comes from clinicaltrials.gov, regardless if we have Japan that has its own registry. That is a goal in the future to be able to take their content. Right now, it is all coming from clinicaltrials.gov, and then it is translated into a country language. We don't have anything in our CTA or contract that says that we use AI to rewrite any of the content. It does say in our contracts that your site name will be listed in public locations. So again, the site name is coming directly from clinicaltrials.gov. Some of our countries, it is, Krista's clinical research site. Other studies and countries, it might be site ABC123. We can override and make sites a little bit more specific, but we do inform them that their site name is going to be listed. We do not list the site contact information directly, so they do not have an email or phone number to reach out to.
All right. Maha, did that answer your question? If you have a follow-up, you can.
Okay, thanks. Hi, Krista. Thanks, Shweta. Yes, it did partially respond. Just to further the point a little bit, I'm wondering, Krista, if your portfolio has trials with studies that have no NCT numbers. So, for example, any kind of long-term studies that might be part of a larger IND, but don't necessarily sit under an NCT number. Have you had experience with those? I guess my larger question is, if the source data comes from the site's own data warehouse, not so much from a public ct.gov listing, would you want our legal teams to have that conversation with your legal teams and talk about tools potentially ingesting, things like study protocol synopsises and things like that, to then have an AI simplified version of the study listing on an AMC's, an academic medical center's TrialX product?
The way that we pull
I don't
our
know if
data,
that was clear.
yeah, the way that we pull our studies is Sanofi has to be listed as a sponsor or collaborator. The study has to be in the recruitment status, and there has to be a site recruiting in that country. So we would never manually enter a site just because, or a site or a study for that matter, just because we have on average 100 studies in 20 countries going at one time. So we want to have that sync with clinicaltrials.gov. So they're doing the updates and everything's done on the TrialX side. So we don't have to manually do those updates. So we wouldn't run into that situation where we would have to manually enter something like a site, investigator initiated study wouldn't be something we'd be working on enrolling with. So we wouldn't have it listed on our SanofiStudies.com website.
Okay, so in that case, if it's an investigator-initiated study that Sanofi collaborates with, the reg sponsor might as well just be the site then, and not Sanofi. That's what I'm hearing. Okay.
Yeah, and if
Okay.
Sanofi is listed as a collaborator, it would come in because it's assigned an NCT number. But if Sanofi is not listed as a collaborator, then it's not on our website.
Understood. So in those cases, you don't need sites to have that proactive conversation with Sanofi, because those things will probably be discussed with the investigator before the CTA is decided, discussed, signed, etc. Okay.
Yes, it's all part of our investigator meeting where we introduce what SanofiStudies.com is, how it's helping the sites out, how they could potentially get, referrals if Sanofi is running any kind of recruitment campaign, how it affects the patients. Again, how we use the AI rewrite to make it simplified for patients.
Okay, thank you. The other thing I wanted to ask was, Shraddha, if I may, I have that question up on top. This is for Sarah. A lot of our studies use REDCap pre-screeners. Sometimes the REDCap pre-screeners are pretty complex enough that they want to link to REDCap directly. REDCap is a Vanderbilt created data capture system that a lot of research studies use across the US, especially academic medical centers. What would the AI do in that case if the REDCap link is embedded in the description? Would it keep the link? Would it add more context around it, or would it remove it?
You mean the link to the pre-screener?
Yes.
I haven't, so at the risk of answering incorrectly, I can certainly follow up with you after the meeting as well. I haven't, the listings that I reviewed, none of them included pre-screening links, but I can't imagine that would be a major barrier. I mean, I would assume the link to the pre-screener could be on these pages. That seems like a fairly simple thing to maintain, unless I'm sort of missing something, but I'm certainly happy to have our team follow up with you afterward as well.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
So I can add in from a Sanofi perspective, we have different kinds of studies. So we have trial listings that are, again, coming directly from clinicaltrials.gov, rewritten with the use of AI. And then the contact information, so this might answer your question, Ken. Also, the or the sites are all listed of who's recruiting for that study. A patient can read that AI rewrite and says, yeah, that, might be something I'm interested in. And they can hit connect, and that will connect them sometimes with the site. So there is a backend email that is associated with that site, or it goes to our trial transparency department and they reach out. There's also study specific websites. So those are ones that we would have a pre-screener attached to that are more customized, that we design and build with the help of Trilex. So no, Ken, the contact feature is not turned off. It's that one of the things that sites have told us is they don't want their contact information being displayed somewhere. So they're fine having it say, contact Krista's site, but they don't want my phone number, again, assuming I'm at a site, my phone number and email plastered on a website. So it is hidden. It is a feature that Sanofi does use, but it is not that you can copy and paste. You submit a referral through the system, and it is tracked that way.
All right, thank you, Krista and Sarah. Next question coming up is, Sarah, this is for you. So you spoke about ways you felt the clarity and overall content could improve in AI simplified listings, but what about accuracy? Did you identify any areas of improvement there?
So overall, when I compared the accuracy of I looked at the AI simplified listing against the source. I didn't see any glaring issues with accuracy. I did notice a couple of things that came up in cases when the source listings for certain studies included little to no detail about study procedures, which was not an isolated case. So in those cases, the model seemed to be almost forcing itself to fill that gap in with something. So it often used very general language that could apply to almost any clinical trial. So, for example, I'm going to quote from one listing that I reviewed, and this is sort of paraphrased, but you'll get the gist. These procedures may include receiving the investigational medication and other drugs and undergoing regular health assessments to monitor the participant's condition and the effects of the treatment. So on the surface, that seems like really informative, but in reality, it actually doesn't say much that couldn't apply to many other trials. So that was a case where, I added to the prompt, only describe study procedures that are explicitly described. In a couple of other cases, I noticed that the model was sometimes inferring study procedures based on the eligibility criteria. So, for instance, there were a couple of cases where there were endoscopies mentioned as part of the eligibility criteria, and the model kind of carried that through into the study procedures and said that the participants would have endoscopies throughout the study, which may or may not have been the case, but I added to the prompt basically, do not infer study procedures from eligibility criteria. But beyond that, really what I saw, the accuracy was strong and I didn't see any glaring issues.
All right, thank you. And we'll take up one last question. And that is, what aspects of listing were more challenging for you to address as you worked on the updated prompts, and what did you learn along the way?
So the easiest parts were the things that were very black and white. For example, telling the model to open the Who Can Participate section with a specific phrase and to use bullet format, that's very straightforward for the model to follow. The hardest parts were where editorial judgment comes in, asking the model to decide what details to include in the listing and what to leave out. So an example of this to kind of illustrate that is how much information do you give about the condition being studied? If somebody has Crohn's disease, for example, or a certain type of cancer, and they're at the point where they're searching for a clinical trial, they probably know what the disease is, and it's almost like kind of over explaining to them to add that detail. On the other hand, they might not, there might be a particular stage of the cancer that's being studied or a particular severity of the disease, and that needs to be explained. So, I included guidance in the prompt, like do not define conditions that patients with the condition would already recognize. However, briefly define less familiar conditions as well as disease modifiers or subtypes that are important for understanding eligibility. But that's where it gets challenging because ultimately that's a judgment call. So there were some outputs that I reviewed where I was like, oh, I really wish they'd explained it had explained a little bit more about that condition. Um, so that's the trade-off I was talking about earlier. Whenever you kind of the things that a human being would sort of say, okay, leave this in, leave this in, take that out, you're kind of relying, unless you want to create very black and white rules, which then can overcorrect very rapidly for specific studies, you're going to have to sort of live with some of those judgments.
Right. Thank you, Sarah. There's one last question I see again on the chat from Austin, and he's asking, how does TrialX AI help with trial discovery for patients? In the raw clinicaltrials.gov data, we noticed there were over 20 different ways that ALK positive could be written, like ALK positive or ALK plus. So these are the different ways. How do we deal with that?
So I have a little bit of experience with that from my past work. The conditions that are listed in clinicaltrials.gov are really the key ones that are used for search terms. I think also the mesh terms can sometimes be used for search, if I recall correctly. Um, I think it's really important for the conditions that are listed in clinicaltrials.gov to include the way a patient would search for the condition. And again, that kind of relies on the study sponsor to put those conditions in. That's really important. I don't believe at this point that and again, I'll follow up if I'm incorrect about this. At this point, I don't believe the AI simplified listings pull in that condition term. However, the condition, will be listed in the study description in a way that the simplification should put it in patient-friendly terms. So doing that as well as putting the condition in the study title, I think also really helps with search because again, the simplification is going to work in terms of the study title and the body, which will then show up in search results and help with discovery of the trials. But I think a real key for sponsors is to list the conditions. You can put all the technical names of the condition as well, but also include the way a patient would search for it, and that really helps.
All
So
right.
I can add that
Yes.
the browse condition name is a official field in the iConnect system. So it's listed under trial condition. That word comes directly from clinicaltrials.gov. There is something similar to mesh terms in the back end of the iConnect system that they would match those. When we work with study teams, that is something we tell them is think of a patient. How would they search for this term? So as an example, we have a study that is hemophilia. And when I went to the study team, I asked them, what might a possible, person be looking for? So they answered congenital bleeding disorders, non-factor hemophilia, blood and lymphatic diseases, if there's any abbreviations. So those are additional keywords that we can manually enter in the back end of the system. So again, although I work for Sanofi, I've worked with the TrialX system, I think, for 6 years. So sometimes I know different things because I have different access to the system. So again, knowing how your patient might search for the disease or condition, we have a specific list of drop-down options that are frequently used browse conditions, but any keyword that you would type in is able to search. Also remember, do they misspell the word? Alzheimer's is frequently misspelled. So we make sure that we put those into our additional keywords.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Krista, for adding there. With that, I guess we'll be wrapping up this webinar today. Thank you, everyone, for your thoughtful questions and engagement. And a big thank you to you, Sarah, for such practical insights, and to our guest contributors, Krista, for adding valuable perspectives. We hope today's session gave you some practical ideas you can take back and apply in your work. And we invite you to join the conversation, continue the conversation with our team to explore collaboration opportunities. And please reach out to our team at info@trialex.com if you have more questions. We will try our best to answer that. And we will share the recording of this webinar on YouTube very soon. And we will share the link with you as well for if you would like to watch later. Thank you, everyone, until next time. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.